you so much, Karen. I greatly appreciate it. Just as a few quick asides, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to put it into the chat. I'll try to look at that and do double duty as much as I can and answer any questions. But if I don't get your question during the presentation, certainly you can. We'll have time at the end to address all those. So I am going to start sharing my screen. So real quick before I get into it, pruning flowering trees and shrubs. This was a fun topic for me to put together. Normally I'm just talking about pruning specifications and things of that nature. And so it was really interesting for me to kind of dig back in and really think about pruning flowering trees and shrubs. For those of you who are outside of the Hampton Roads area, you'd be amazed at how far along we are here in Hampton Roads with everything popping out. We're probably, I would say, a month ahead of ourselves this year due to the unseasonably warm temperatures we've been having. Bradford pears are in full bloom, daffodils are up, and I've seen some cherries blooming, as well as our saucer magnolias are already blooming. And so there's a lot out there that's going on, and my allergies are telling the tale of that. So pollen on the cars, all that good stuff. Oh, I even saw catkins on oak trees today. So it's going to be an interesting season this year. So very, very timely presentation to give. So give me just a second to get this popped up, and hopefully everybody can see that. So thank you again for everybody attending. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Let me just see here. So what is pruning? It's basically the removal or reduction of plant parts based upon goals and specifications. Now, for this presentation specifically, we're going to be looking at flowering trees and shrubs. So while we prune, it's to maintain plant health, improve the quality of the flowers or the fruit, also to restrict size, remove dead and diseased branches, and to improve the structure of the plant. Because otherwise, if we did nothing, the plant would grow in every which way, shape, or form, and would not look very well in our landscapes. And also, most of our plants that we have in our landscapes aren't really designed by God to be growing in landscapes. They're designed to be growing in the wild amongst other trees and shrubs. And so when you take something out of its natural environment and you put it in another environment, like our yards, landscapes, arboretums, they grow in a completely different habit. And typically the light that they get is unlike what they would get in their natural habitat. So that can also help influence how these plants are growing and what their structure and size is. So how we prune something like a crepe myrtle is going to be completely different than, let's say, this camellia we see here. And certainly for size, form, function, and then also, again, we want to make sure that we're doing the pruning in a way that's going to help promote what it's there for. This shrub is there for the beautiful red flowers that it has on it. Again, the azaleas, how we prune azaleas is going to be different from hydrangeas. So hopefully once we get through this presentation, everyone will have a better idea as to how to do that. Let's see, I'm just pulling up some quick chats here just to see some questions. Do you think we'll be at risk of frost again? And what would the effect of the stone fruit production? So in Hampton Roads, it's a wild card. Are we going to get a late season frost? I don't know. I mean, I'm looking ahead a month out at the forecast, and I'm not seeing any indications that we're going to get some significant cold temperatures. If the underground weather guy that I follow is correct, he's predicting some big Atlantic coast snowstorm. So, but I just don't see it. And in my gut, I'm not feeling that we're going to have that problem. Now, if you're in further west of here, yeah, there's definitely the possibility that you could have a late season frost, and certainly could affect the stone fruit production. Fruit trees and grapevines, I'm not really going to get into fruit tree and grapevine pruning. This is more of for the just aesthetic pruning of trees and shrubs and landscape. But some of the information that I put out there, you can apply to those types of things. So hopefully that answers those questions. Excuse me. So one of the biggest things I see out in the landscape is bad pruning cuts. And this presentation is going to give you a lot of good information on how to make good pruning cuts and what bad pruning cuts look like, so that's half the battle. If we're making good pruning cuts, then we're going to have a healthier plant. We're less likely to introduce disease or decay into the plant, and it's overall going to be better. So we're going to go into a little bit of tree biology. The branch bark ridge, that's basically the raised area of bark in the branch crotch, and it marks where the branch wood and the trunk wood meet. And I have illustrations too, so don't get too caught up on all the words. So the branch collar is where the tissue forms at the base of the branch and becomes more pronounced as vigor decreases. So here we see a good illustration of where that branch collar is. And then also, I'm going to squish down my screen a little bit here there so I can see all my slides better. And then the branch bark ridge. You can see the branch bark ridge is that bubbled up area right there at the crotch. That's a really good crotch on that branch because it has a nice U shape. I wish I had the ability to point at things and you could see my pointer, and but we would want to make that cut. Oh, sorry, I touched my screen. Make that cut just on the outside of that branch bark ridge in a basically perpendicular fashion from that ridge down to the collar. I'll have some other slides that'll further emphasize that. So the branch bark collar and ridge are less pronounced on shrubs. So that's where it gets a little more difficult. Here we see a shrub. If you look at where that small stem attaches to the larger stem, you'll see kind of a swollen area. And that's your branch bark collar starting to form there. If we were pruning that little twig off, you would be able to make that cut. And here's a little more close-up view of that. You can almost, where that darker coloration is at the bottom of the twig, you can see a ring that's going right around that. And you would be making that cut just to the outside of that ring. So right there. So now if you were doing a reduction cut, the second white area, the white arrow is pointing to that area where you would make that cut just above where that branch bark ridge is on the lateral limb there. And I'll get in further down the line of how you would make that cut to help avoid future problems with that branch. Because inevitably, anytime we prune a limb, we want to ensure the survivability of that limb. Let me just see, chat. I think my pointer was working. Awesome. Thank you for that feedback. So if somebody can see my cursor and give me a thumbs up on the chat, I would greatly appreciate that. So this is the line that we would be making that cut on that reduction cut. And then of course over here, this is where, let me just double check the chat. Yes, awesome. Thank you so much. So right out here, this is where if we were reducing or removing this limb over here, we would make that cut right outside of that little ring there. So again, I'll get into a little bit further detail as I progress into the presentation. So we're going to get into a little bit about making a proper cut on larger branches, just because some of you do have fruit trees and other trees, and I can talk a little bit about fruit tree pruning as well. But we want to make sure that you're making a good cut. So the cut is made immediately in front of the branch collar. Don't cut into the branch bark ridge. Do not leave a stub. Cut from the bottom up if needed and should result in a flat surface with adjacent bark firmly attached. Some of those things may not make sense, but when I'm going on, you should be able to see a better illustration of that. So here we can see two different illustrations. I'm sure quite a few of you have seen this on the diagram A. And some of us may have made these cuts. Even a professional arborist sometimes has a peel where you make the cut, and particularly in the spring and the sap is up, and there's too much branch weight at the end. So as you're cutting through, it will start to break and then peel down, which now we've wounded the tree. So now not only does the tree have to compartmentalize this wound here, it's also going to have to work on compartmentalizing this wound down here and developing callus tissue. And again, this is where we can introduce decay. And here on the left side of that, you can see where branches died off and broken, and how the tree naturally is forming that collar around that area. Now, B is what would be ideal. You come a little bit out from the branch bark collar and you make a slight undercut, and then you make your uppercut and cut the way through. Now, as you come out and make this cut here at number 2, as you come out and make this cut at number 2, typically what happens is the branch starts to fall, and then naturally it's going to want to peel. So it peels back to this undercut and then breaks off. So you prevent that peel from going all the way down the trunk. Once you've taken all the weight off the end of that branch, then you can come back and make your nice cut here at the branch bark collar and the branch bark ridge. Proper undercuts were not made. So this is a picture I took at a Target parking lot out in Virginia Beach. And unfortunately, these red maples were not pruned properly. You can see that most of these pruning cuts, if you want to call them pruning cuts, were made from the ground, most likely with a power pole pruner, because you can see the angle where somebody was standing and making that cut. But this further illustrates what I was talking about, the ripping. So if you're not making proper cuts, and the weight of that branch, because obviously it was much bigger, would break off and peel down. So now not only is the tree dealing with this horrific pruning, it's also having to compartmentalize other wounds that shouldn't be there. So here's a good illustration of a cut that's been made to the edge of the collar. So some trees have a very, very pronounced collar and ridge, and a good pruning cut typically will leave kind of like a little nub out from the tree. It won't be flush with the trunk. And there are a lot of hormones and things in this area right here that are released to let the tree know that, hey, this branch isn't here. We now have a wound, and we need to compartmentalize and seal off this wound and prevent decay from entering into the tree itself. So decay is compartmentalized through 4 different walls, and we won't get into that, but nonetheless, it's all about making a good, proper cut. So a stub indicates where a branch was pruned too far out. It was kind of like in that illustration A. So the tree is not able to compartmentalize one of those walls. You can see it's starting to form that collar, but decay can still progress into the stem of the tree from a pruning cut such as this. Now, if I had my choice, I would much rather see a stub, excuse me, I'd much rather see a stub than a cut that's made flush with the tree itself, to where it's a bad pruning cut and you've cut into the branch bark collar and the ridge and it's not able to seal properly. If you've ever seen this on a tree where you have callus tissue all the way around an old pruning cut and it's completely closed off, this was a good cut. And this is also an indicator that the tree has effectively sealed off that wound and decay is not going to progress anywhere in this tree. Let's see, I got a couple questions. What should I do if the wind breaks a branch and strips the bark down? So if a wind breaks a limb off and it does strip the bark down, just try to make a clean cut at the bottom of that if it's still hanging on so that you can get the limb off. If it strips it and the bark peels down all the way, unfortunately, there's really not anything that you can do. Suzanne, you said you're not seeing examples, just the list of info on making a proper cut. So did you see any of my pictures that I had up there on proper cuts, where to make them? So you can respond to that. But yeah, so if it does strip down and peel that bark down, there's not a lot you can do. Just you have to let the tree just deal with it naturally. Some, not all. Okay. I'm not sure why you're not able to see all of my pictures. Is anybody else having that issue so far? You can just type in and let me know. I'm going to keep progressing because I have a lot of slides as well. So here is a good illustration of a pruning cut that was made too close to the tree. So they've effectively cut into the branch bark ridge, and they definitely cut out all of the branch bark collar. So all pictures are good for me. I can see the pictures. Good, wonderful, thank you. So this is a bad pruning cut, and typically the end result is you get damage to the trunk and decay into the trunk wood. So this is a side cut of what you would see from a poor pruning cut like this. You can really see where that decay is starting to move in and up and down. So the tree has a very difficult time of compartmentalizing that. This is the other indication that you would see if it's after the fact. You would see very uneven callus growth around that pruning cut. So this is one that was made too close at the top and too close at the bottom. Basically, those hormones weren't released to effectively start forming that callus tissue around that wound. And then a lot of times as well, it'll result in sprouting around that wound. So not only is the tree dealing with a bad pruning cut and not compartmentalizing and sealing properly, but it will also start to send out sucker sprouts as well. So now you got to go back and prune off sucker sprouts over time until that seals off a little bit better. So nodes is something you also need to know about. So nodes is a part of the tree, basically where the leaf and the petiole attach. Usually there is a bud just right at the base of that petiole of the leaf. And usually, excuse me, these buds are dormant. And some you can see, some you can't. But for the most part, they're visible. And we'll talk about making Sorry about that. We'll talk about making good reduction cuts later, and we'll mention the node and the bud and that type of thing. So just want to give you a little bit of tree biology if you had never heard of what a node is on a plant. Now you know. So now we're going to start getting into the nitty gritty, which you truly signed up to hear me talk about for an hour. So spring flowering shrubs and summer flowering shrubs. So we have to distinguish both of those things because it's important to know and determine what time of year we need to be pruning those so that we're not cutting all the blooms off for the next year. So spring flowering shrubs bloom on 1 year old growth from the previous summer, and then generally bloom before the end of June. Summer flowering shrubs bloom from new growth in spring of the current year. So those are the shrubs and trees that we want to be pruning in the late winter, early spring. And when I say late winter, early spring, my favorite time of year to do hard pruning, reductions, even some shearing, things of that nature, is usually in that late February, early March timeframe. And I'll tell you why. The reason I like pruning that time of year is because, one, we pretty much know that that plant is not going to shoot out new growth in a short amount of time and have some cold temperatures and kill off that new growth that hasn't hardened off just yet. And the other thing is just it's less stressful. And then even more importantly, it's aesthetically, it's less unappealing, particularly if you're cutting something back very hard. You don't have to wait very long before that plant is pushing new growth and trying to fill in those gaps. So let me go to the chat here and see there was any other things. No, I think it's good. So we'll move along. So talk a little bit about pruning tools. Here we see some various types of tools that you would use given on what size limbs that you would be cutting. Obviously, you could invest in a nice handsaw. Typically, I like the curved handsaw. This one in this picture is called a Silky. It's a high-end professional grade handsaw that most arborists use, but there are a lot of similar ones out on the market. Corona makes a really good one that's only about $20 or so. But it has these double-edged teeth, so you're cutting from a forward motion and a pulling motion. So push-pull, you're cutting both ways. Everybody knows good old loppers. I know that loppers are great for cutting some bigger stems, particularly if you don't have the hand strength. You get a lot of leverage with these long levers arms on those, and so you can cut 1 to 2 inch. Felcos, everybody needs a good set of Felcos. It's always nice to have a nice set of hand pruners. And then the smaller ones like these Friskers here, they're just for really small fine-tuned pruning. You may not be cutting anything big at all with that. More along the lines of you would use that on your like perennials and annuals. You're not really cutting woody stems with more of the scissor type pruning. Hibiscus. Pat, could you explain hibiscus, what you're meaning by that? So I'll get back to you. So if you have one of these, throw it away, put it in the garbage. These bow saws are not very accurate. I tend to think that you can make a decent pruning cut with it, but this just isn't the right tool for pruning small trees or shrubs. If you have one for cutting down your Christmas tree, have at it. But if you're going to be pruning trees or shrubs with this saw, I think you have the wrong tool. The other thing that's really important is get you a good set of gloves. One of my guys always has a saying anytime we switch out to a new blade on a handsaw is new blades love blood. So anytime you, it's very important to have a sharp blade on your saw, or excuse me, keep your blades sharp on your hand pruning tools, and keep your fingers out of the way. But sometimes if you're doing small fine pruning, your fingers might be in the way, and I've been the recipient of handsaw cuts. I've actually almost taken the end of my finger off holding something, and then using hand pruners if I'm clipping off some things, and I've grabbed the side of my finger close to where I'm pruning. And yeah, so a good set of gloves may not prevent you cutting yourself, but it may make the difference between a Band-Aid or a trip to the emergency room. So just something good to keep in mind there. When to prune, they haven't started to green out. When do we prune? I'm getting there. So I'm definitely getting there, Pat. So let's see here. So there's different types of pruning. Certainly one type is structural pruning or thinning. So selective removal of live branches to increase light, reduce wind resistance, or reduce weight should result in an even distribution of branches and should not remove more than 25% at one time. The 25% rule typically goes more for a little bit more mature established plants. If you have a young tree or shrub, you may take out more than 25% at one time. And some of those shrubs, you may be taking out 80 to 90% because you're doing rejuvenation or renovation pruning. So this rule applies more for trees than it does shrubs. So just a quick illustration to show that if we were to let a tree go and not perform any maintenance on it at all, certainly it would have its own way and grow every which way, have a poor structure, and not be as beautiful as we would like it to. Now, typically this would be a tree that was growing in an open area without any interference. But when trees are pruned when they're young and we start establishing that proper branch spacing and structure, we end up with a much nicer tree with a central lead, even branch distribution, even branch spacing, that type of thing. So this is one of my clients out in Suffolk a couple years back. He had a row of red rocket crepe myrtles, and you can see these are all very multi-stemmed trees. Most of these trees, when you buy them from a nursery, don't naturally have multi-stems from one root system. This is actually multiple trees put in one pot to give you this effect. River birches are the same. They typically don't grow in 3s and 4s. They're multiple trees put in a pot, and then we just let them go, and it forms 3 or 4 nice trunks. For crepe myrtles, for example, anything that's multi-stemmed, you want about 3 or 4 stems coming up from the base of the tree or the base of the ground, and you want them to have some good branch spacing. So this is a close-up of one of those trees, and you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stems coming out of the ground. Now, if we were to let this tree grow and not remove any of these main stems, certainly all of these are going to be growing in diameter. They're going to start pushing together. Some of the stems may get crowded out as it ages, and actually some of the bigger stems or more dominant stems in the tree will choke out the smaller ones. And so for a tree that's been growing for a while, you could end up losing a significant portion of the canopy and make a big hole in it. So it's better to correct this when they are young. So this is what it looks like after it was pruned. So we got it down to 4 stems. The angle doesn't show it right, but there is some spacing in between these two branches here. And certainly some of the cuts couldn't make all the way back, so you just try to go as low as you possibly can without damaging the other stem. But you want to create some great branch spacing at the base of the tree. So now all of these individual leads have a lot of room to grow and to increase in diameter, and they're not going to be interfering with one another. So here you can see a couple trees that I pruned, these 2 right here. You can see how much more branch spacing they have now. As a young tree, certainly did I create some holes and gaps in the upper canopy? Yes, I did. But now these remaining stems are going to start flushing out growth to help close in these gaps and form that canopy back. Trees want to have a canopy. So it's okay to make hard pruning decisions and bigger cuts when they're young, because the tree is so vigorous. In a season's time, this will all close back in. I would love to get back out to this property. It's been quite a few years since I've been out there. I'd love to see what these trees look like now and get a picture of what it would look like several years down the road. But you can see by the brush piles on the ground, that's the other illustration, is that I definitely took out more than 25% of this canopy. Again, for a young tree that's very vigorous, these trees had only been in the ground probably, I think, about 3 years at this point. They're going to be just fine and have plenty of time to bounce back. It's the same 3 to 4 stem rule apply for dwarf crepe myrtles. They're more like shrubs. No, I wouldn't say that that rule particular. I mean, as a shrub, you want it thick and full, right? We don't have anything there that's growing way up into the sky and could potentially have structural issues where something would break out. The likelihood of a dwarf crepe myrtle having something break out of it when it's only, most dwarf crepe myrtles I see are only about 1.5 feet, 2 foot off the ground. It's not likely. So that rule does not have to apply for the dwarfs. Now, if you want to do it like that and you want to open it up some, have at it, do it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's just dwarf plants grow at a much slower rate. So that time that it'll take to fill in those gaps and holes is going to be significantly increased. We're going to move on to reduction pruning. So this is something that we do a lot of, particularly when we're trying to prune something to a specific shape. And you might have a limb that's growing out way too far, and we want to reduce it back to bring it back within the shape and structure of the canopy. So this is when we shorten a branch or stem or leader by cutting to a lateral branch that is large enough to assume dominance. So when I say large enough to assume dominance, the rule of reduction cuts is 1/3. So if the size of this cut right here, for example, was 3 inches across, I would want to reduce it to a branch that was at least 1 inch in diameter. Sometimes that's not always possible, but that's the general rule of thumb, because when you reduce it back to something that's at least 1/3 the diameter, we are going to ensure that the survivability of that branch. There's going to be probably enough biomass out here, leaves, twigs, branches, that they're going to still able to feed and sustain the remaining portion of that limb. Plus, we're not making a huge cut here that's still small enough to where that tree is going to be able to compartmentalize and seal that wound off. So this is some of the debate with regard to making a reduction cut when you're not removing, whoa, sorry about that. When you're not removing a branch, but you're reducing like a main stem back to a branch. So it used to be thought that that final cut was right above that. Again, there's the branch bark ridge, the collar's down here, dagnabbit. And it used to be thought that you make that cut at an angle parallel with the lateral limb that you're pruning it back to. I would say the better cut is either to, based on the diameter of the branch, you can either do the cut at C, which is you just come straight across just above the branch bark ridge, or you can kind of draw a line in between that perpendicular area here, C and A, and that's your final cut. So it's not quite parallel with the lateral limb, and it's not quite straight across. But I have a little bit different philosophy. Sometimes smaller limbs, it's just easier to make that cut like C. And then also, you think about the amount of surface area at the line C versus the yellow line versus A. As you move up closer to C, the surface area of that wound is getting smaller and smaller. So again, the tree is able, the smaller the wound, the better, right? So if you can't make it at a slight angle in between those two, just make it at that C going across. You're going to reduce the amount of surface area that that tree has to deal with. There's still a lot of debate in the arboriculture community about whether you make it straight across or at a slight angle. I don't think you're going to be wrong doing it either way. So when cutting it back, this is the 1/3 rule. And then also lateral cut should not remove more than 1/4 of the leaf surface area of any branch or leader. So again, it's that you don't take out any more than 25% of one limb at one time, and you cut it back to a lateral that's 1/3 the size. So you want to try to avoid pruning it back to something that's too small to assume dominance. Now, in the situation, we have not had an ice storm here in a long, long time, but sometimes that's all you have, right? You don't have a large limb to cut it back to, or lateral branch to cut it back to. So you have to cut it back to something a little bit smaller. You always run the risk of, if it's too small, that whole branch may die back, or may die back further down to another leader. But again, sometimes you don't have that choice to make. Again, here is a situation where you have two codominant stems. You do your first cut, that undercut we were talking about, and the second cut. So you want to remove the weight so that you prevent that peeling. And then you come back in and make that final cut. In this situation, I would make my cut at that C line every time. I'm going to limit the surface area that I'm exposing. And over time, the tree is going to continue to grow, particularly if this were a young tree, maybe a 6-7 inch diameter, 8-inch diameter tree trunk down here. As this thing grows, if this is going to be a 20-30 inch tree in its lifetime, diameter wise, you won't ever see where that cut's made. It'll compartmentalize, seal over, and then everything will continue to grow on. So again, my preference would be to cut along that red line. So here's an example. These are some red buds out at the Virginia Tech Agricultural Research Extension Center next to the building. And there's a parking lot right here. And you can see where this tree didn't naturally grow in this funny bow shape, and then all of a sudden branches are shooting up. They had to be pruned to increase that clearance for the parking lot. So here you can see some reduction cuts that were made in the past to help back to lateral limbs to help direct that growth up and away from the parking lot. Here is I just use this smaller branch for an example. It's sticking out a little bit far, and we want to do some reduction on it to bring it back in within the shape of the tree. So you can see here, that's where that reduction cut was made to a node. If you remember what I was talking about nodes earlier, we got the leaf, the petiole comes down and the bud is just right there. And that reduction cut was just made outside of that bud. Again, I'll show you what it looked like before, and that's what it looks like after. So if you're making good reduction cuts, a lot of time on a branch like this, if you do it properly, the tree is not going to look hacked. It's going to still look natural. And in a season's time, this growth will start to push out this way in the tree as well. Here's a little close-up of that. So again, that's where that node was, just above the bud, cut back. This is what would be an example of a heading cut. So this is where we're not cutting it back to anything specific. There's not a node, there's not a little dormant bud or anything like that. We're cutting it back. And trees will respond differently to that. A lot of times there's dormant buds somewhere in this area, and you'll get a suckering out of growth from a cut like this versus a cut like this. We're redirecting all the flow of nutrients to, we're helping that branch put its energy into something out here. There's a question. What type of tree is that? It's a red bud. So this was late in the season. That's why it looks so poor. These trees are next to a parking lot, get a lot of sun. So a little bit of sun scald going on there as well. So heading cut, and then this would again be a nice reduction cut back to a lateral limb. You can see that this lateral limb is about roughly probably half of the diameter of that. So we're well above that 1/3 rule of a reduction cut. And again, now the tree is going to be redirecting all its resources out to this lateral limb. So proper pruning cuts on shrubs. Here's an illustration. If you have opposite buds, again, that's straight across here. If you were to make the cut way up here, so now we're doing more of a heading cut. So what would happen in this situation is this little portion here would die back. This dormant bud would break and start to grow off. I'm sure you have gone out and looked at shrubs that you've pruned in the past, and you'll see that little dead stub and then a flush of growth coming out. That's what causes that. So if you prune it back here, tree knows how to respond to it. This one, you're making the cut just a little bit too close to the bud. You want a little bit of separation there. Again, not too much angle. Certainly you can do a little bit of an angle cut when you're doing reduction cuts back to dormant buds. But again, I would probably make that cut more like this as opposed to an angle. Just that's my personal preference on my experience over the years. Here we can see now some plants respond really well to heading cuts. Azalea is one of them. So you can see an old heading cut right here where it wasn't cut back to lateral, it was just clipped back. And the plant responded by sending out a ton of suckers that all formed into individual little branches on that. So again, this is the limb. When I'm coming in to prune, we're going to prune this. We're trying to maintain the size of this azalea and keep it more in a natural form and shape, not pruning it to any type of hard edge. So we're going to take this long branch out, and sometimes what you can do is you can just hide it. You can cut it way back in, because if this dies back, no big deal, because everything else is around it kind of covering that cut up, and you don't have to waste your time of reaching way down in the shrub and trying to cut it all the way to the base. Heading cuts. Heading cuts, you've heard me mention that a bit. It's when you cut back to a stub or a lateral that's too small to assume dominance. Typically, heading cuts are acceptable on current year's growth, such as with shrubs. So when you shear a shrub and you're just taking that new growth off, you're basically making 1,000,000 heading cuts. Trees, on the other hand, do not respond well to heading cuts. So you can see here where this tree was topped, you get all of these epicormic sprouts coming out of the trunk. And the problem with that is, one, you run the probability of that stem just dying out if it doesn't have enough vigor to push out new growth. Two, all of these branches are very poorly attached. So if this was to continue to grow and you could get some big winds or things like that, those limbs would be a much higher likelihood of failure. Heading cuts too as well, if you're doing that with shrubs, which is perfectly acceptable to do heading cuts on shrubs. You want to make sure that your tools are sharp. You can see that somebody used a set of hedge clippers and their blades probably were not sharp, and you can see some of these cuts where it looks like it was just chewed off. And thank you very much for that. And we'll move on to the next. So this is kind of how things respond to a heading cut, particularly with shrubs. You'll get like new sprouts popping out everywhere. Here's 1 year later. Whereas if your goal is to not make that shrub thick, then you would do more of thinning cuts. That would mean like pruning it back to a lateral, such as here. And then again, that plant is redirecting the flow. So you're not going to get that proliferation of a bunch of growth at one spot. So pollarding is not topping. So this is a big hot topic, particularly with regard to crepe myrtles, because there are areas that cut the crepe myrtles back. The first year cuts are typically made back at branch unions or to lateral buds. Only remove the current year's growth on successive years, and do not remove the knuckles. So this is what a good pollarded tree looks like that has been managed over the years. These are actually London plane trees at our lab down in Charlotte, North Carolina. These trees have been in our grounds and been pruned this way. They were started at a very young age when they started this process. Sometimes with pollarding trees, you don't always get the opportunity to start it at such a young age and make those cuts at a young age. But what you want to see are these knuckles starting to form. And what this actually is, you can see this is, quite a few years of pruning cuts made over and over. And these are all proper pruning cuts. If you look at these, you can see a lot of callus tissue. And what the plant does over time, the reason they develop these knuckles is the tree starts to develop a reserve of starches there at the knuckles, as opposed to storing all that energy in the root system and pushing it back up and pushing out new growth. It gets stored up here as well. So that's how you can get 8 to 10, 12 foot of growth in a year, because there's already energy up there ready to push out that new growth. The other thing is that this is a lot of callus tissue. So we don't have decay progressing down into the stem. We don't have dieback. And the tree knows how to respond to all of these pruning cuts that were made. So this is a house in Virginia Beach. I was riding by one day and I was like, oh my gosh, I got to take a picture of this. You can see in the background that these crepe myrtles were pollarded at one time. You can see the knuckles. And then whoever pruned them after this go round actually pruned it just above the knuckles. So they're changing the level of which that new growth is going to come out, particularly on this crepe myrtle here at the right rear where my cursor is. You can almost see a second level of knuckles starting to form. My preference would have been just to take it back to the knuckles. Now, Here in the front's a pear tree. Now, if there was any tree in the world to do an Appalachian topiary, as we call it, for those of you that are from Southwest Virginia, Appalachian Power, and we know what the power company likes to do to trees to keep our lights on, rightfully so. But a lot of times they have to hack trees back because they got to keep them out of the lines. This tree is not pollarded. This tree is absolutely topped. However, I will say this: if you look at the branch structure of this tree, if it were allowed to continue to grow, this tree probably wouldn't be around much longer because it would split apart. So you are actually effectively reducing the wind load on that tree. Do I condone topping? No. But I thought it's just an interesting point of discussion to talk about. This is typically what we see with pollarded crepe myrtles. A lot of times this is the landscaper coming in. And also they did a great mulching job around this with the volcano mulch. But they cut it back really hard. So there's no knuckle. They didn't cut it back to any lateral limbs. They made crappy pruning cuts. They scarred the trunk. And trees are very resilient. This tree probably put out new growth. It probably didn't die back. I never saw the outcome of what this tree ended up looking like. But nonetheless, this is not what we're going for. Heading cuts. So again, heading cuts are rarely used except in shrub pruning. You cut to a shoot or bud, cut branch or stem to a stub, but the key is making a clean cut. And again, this is shrub pruning. So this is a close-up illustration of that other picture I had earlier. You can see that a lot of heading cuts here. So they were just cutting it back to a certain height. Again, shrub pruning. Some shrubs you have to cut it back hard, and but you want to have, sorry about that, you just want to make good clean cuts. So if this were to happen on a job site, shears weren't exactly sharp, I would go back with a set of Felcos and clean those cuts up. I'm going to speed up just a little bit because I don't want to take too much of y'all's time. Shearing is a great practice if it's performed accordingly. Over time, all the new growth is pushed to the exterior of the plant, which then reduces interior growth or it becomes absent. It's a good idea to alternate between shearing and thinning to encourage new growth. That way, if you have any dieback or anything like that, so this is actually a photo I took today. This is a Yopon holly or Japanese holly. It's been sheared to this nice round shape, maintained. It's a very formal landscape, but you open it up, what don't you see? You don't see any growth on the interior. So if a branch or two were to start to die out in this, you're going to have a big hole until lateral branches can fill back in. So that's why it's good to do some thinning along the way to help let that light in and let some of that new growth on the inside start to push up. That way, if you do have dieback, it'll fill back in. Also, shrubs like this tend to end up with more pest problems because you have poor air circulation. You get moisture buildup inside, all sorts of other issues. So a couple other types of pruning: rejuvenation pruning. Stems reduced to a height of about 6 inches from the ground. Pruning is in the spring before new growth flushes out. Usually rejuvenation pruning is something that's a really, really, really hard cutback. You want to complete this on like a 3 to 5 year process. In other words, you're only going to do this every 3 to 5 years. Species that respond well to that are typically these multi-stem species. So red twig dogwood, viburnum, spirea, quince, forsythia, witch hazel, beautyberry. But beautyberry you only take down maybe not quite as far, just about a foot from the ground. Oak leaf hydrangea, lilac, and honeysuckle. So here's an illustration basically where you would rejuvenation prune back close to the ground. And here's a before and after of red twig dogwood. That's, or actually I'm This is a before, and this is what it looked like after rejuvenation pruning. So multi-stem plant, that's what's beautiful about it. Sometimes things get overgrown, leggy, what have you. You want to cut it back and get it to start over and push out new growth. Renovation pruning is removal of older woody stems have lost their vigor, decreased flower production. Helps to increase light to new or vigorous growth on the interior of the plant. You're going to remove approximately 30% of the old stems, and plants that are multi-stems whose growth develops from the base of the root system. So that's the type of plant you're looking for to do this type of pruning. Renovation, rejuvenation, it's almost interchangeable to some extent, except you're leaving that on renovation pruning, you're leaving that newer growth. And I see questions. Did not know about renovation or rejuvenation pruning. So yeah, that's basically for some of those things that are just, they've gotten old and tired. Sometimes even shrubs in the landscape. I've seen hollies. Now, granted, if you have a big holly stem tree, you're not going to do renovation or rejuvenation pruning because you're going to cut it back to a stump. This is typically for a little bit more multi-stem plants, not big cuts, right? Something you're going to do with a handsaw, not a chainsaw. So here's a good example of what renovation pruning would look like. Shrub on the left, it's getting old and tired. You're getting some older stems going up, and you can see how it's thinned out a little bit, created some spacing. Again, this isn't the best illustration, but again, you're going to have a lot of new sprouts coming up and starting to fill in the gaps. And is it too late to on an large oak leaf hydrangea? No, I don't think it's too late at all. We're in a really, really good time span. So this is what you've all been waiting for. And again, if you have any questions about what species to prune during the dormant season and which ones to prune after flowering, it's no secret. You can go online and find all of this information. Quite honestly, I don't have all this information on the top of my head for a lot of these species. I have to look it up as well. So I tried to pick out the list of things that typically we have here in Hampton Roads. Butterfly bush, crepe myrtle, hawthorns, the grandiflora hydrangea, Spirea japonica, beautyberry, roses Sharon, roses, and abelia. These are all things that we want to prune in the dormant season because they bloom off the current year's growth. And I have a question. So, great. There are hydrangeas that bloom later in the season. And this is where you have to know what cultivar of hydrangea you have, because there are hydrangeas that you can prune in the spring, and then there are hydrangeas that you have to wait till after they bloom to prune. So after flowering, example that has big leaf hydrangeas, smooth hydrangea, PG hydrangea. These are all cultivars that you want to wait till after they bloom to prune back. So I would say if you ever had a doubt, it is never bad to prune after the plant flowers. So if you want to ensure that you're going to have blooms next year, you can always prune them after they flower. So if you miss the timing in the spring, then you can wait till it blooms and then prune it back. Any shrub that you're going to prune back really, really hard, because you're just looking at it thinking, man, this has gotten too big. I need it smaller. I don't care if I lose the blooms this year. Then that's when you do it in that late February, early March timeframe. or late March. When I say late February, early March, that's the ideal based on the weather conditions. But if you get a little late in the time and you want to wait till it gets a little warmer, I've pruned things back hard, like we've pollarded crepe myrtles back in the beginning of April, and they still pushed out growth. So the good news is most plants are very forgiving. If you're going to do a hard cut back, though, just don't do it late in the summer when it's hot and it's dry and the plant is stressed. So I am just a few minutes over. I apologize, but I will exit out of here. And if anyone has any additional questions, I am more than happy to answer. So think about Loropetalum. Loropetalum are blooming right now. So really you want to prune them back after they finish blooming. So again, if you have to do a hard cutback and you don't care if they lose their blooms, then have at it right now. Now's a great time. But typically things that are blooming right now, those buds were set back last year in the fall. Any other questions? Anybody have any additional questions for me? Please feel free to type it in, or I'm more than willing to stay on and answer questions.
Well, we have a poll that we're going to run while the questions are, if you have any further questions, please take our poll so that we can know how you enjoyed our program and what programs you're interested in the future. And Jason, thank you so much. If there are no other questions, we are incredibly grateful for all the information. It was very informative and I've taken a lot of notes.
Wonderful. Well, again, nothing that I presented today is a secret, right? All the information is out there. You can find it online. Just make sure you check your sources. Half the battle is just knowing what species you're looking at. And again, if I didn't get into fruit tree pruning, I apologize. I know I said I'd mention that, and I'll make a quick note. Fruit tree pruning, 3 to 5 stems, main stems coming out from the trunk. It's always a good idea to thin your fruit out as well as thin the tree. And a lot of fruit tree pruning, if you want real good quality fruit, one, you want to be able to reach it, right? So don't let your fruit tree get super tall. You prune out a lot of the vertical sprouts, or you do a combination of thinning and reduction. So bring in that canopy down to a lower level. And then don't let those lateral limbs get too long where they're going to become overweighted by the fruit and split out. So any of you that ever had that happen, that grow fruit trees certainly have seen what overproduction can do to the weight and also cause limbs to break. So it's always a good idea too to thin that fruit out as it's developing. You're also, again, redirecting the flow to the other healthier fruit.
And we did have a question about when do you recommend pruning Calicanthus?
Honestly, I don't know. So, but I'm sure you can find it online. But yeah, that's one I'm not super familiar with. I'm sorry.
And then there's one last about deer eating leaves off camellias and what to do about, should it cut back the chewed off part? Should they cut the camellia pretty hard?
Right. Well, if the deer are browsing on your camellia, the best thing to do is just try to find a way to keep the deer away from it. I know it might be unsightly, but if it's your prized camellia, if you can create some type of fencing to keep the deer back away, that's good. There are products out there that are taste deterrents. Some of them are basically, the active ingredient is putrefied eggs, so it does not smell well at all. and they don't persist very long on the plant. Now, if you go with a professional company, I know we offer like deer services, like treatments that we can apply to the plant. It's a taste deterrent. The only downside to those products is they leave kind of like a slight film or residue on the plant that's visible. So we try to use one product we use has a little bit of green coloring in it, so it's not like this white powdery looking surface to the leaf. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of really great options. With respect to pruning, I would try to find like a lateral stem or bud to prune that back to, just so if you're taking off the damage. Usually deer though, they make a pretty clean cut on the plant. So I haven't seen too many animal. Squirrels do the same thing, chewing off the ends of branches and stuff in the spring, which if you walk out in your yard and there's a bunch of little branches on the ground with leaves on it, and you see like a little angled cut, almost look like somebody cut the end of the branch off, but it's in an angle. Typically that's squirrel damage. So I get that question a lot. And there's also some other insects that will cause branch ends to break off, like twig girdler and things of that nature.
Well, thank you so very much for staying on an extra few minutes and answering questions. We really appreciate your time this evening.
Absolutely, my pleasure, anytime.
Thank you.
Everyone have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, you as well. And everyone, this ends our presentation. Please come back next month for our garden talk. And we are grateful for your attendance this evening. Good night.